What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're covering a story that's marking the end of an era in televangelism. We're talking about the death of one of the most controversial and influential religious figures of the 1980s and 90s, Jimmy Swaggart. Now, whether you loved him or couldn't stand him, there's no denying that Jimmy Swaggart was one of the most recognizable faces in Christian television for decades. And his story, from massive success to scandal to redemption, reads like something straight out of Hollywood. So let's start with what we know. Jimmy Swaggart passed away on July 1, 2025, at the age of 90. The news broke through his own ministry's social media channels, and major news outlets quickly picked up the story. According to reports, Swaggart suffered a heart attack about 2 weeks before his death. He was hospitalized in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the same city where he built his televangelism empire decades ago. His family has announced that funeral services will be held at the Family Worship Center in Baton Rouge, with both a regular Sunday morning service and a celebration of life service planned. To understand why this death is making headlines, you have to understand just how massive Jimmy Swaggart was at his peak. We're talking about a guy who went from being an itinerant preacher in Louisiana to becoming one of the most watched televangelists in America. In the 1980s, Swaggart's television program was broadcast on over 250 stations worldwide. His ministry was pulling in millions of dollars, and he was reaching an estimated 500 million people globally. This wasn't just religious programming. This was mass entertainment with a spiritual twist. Swaggart wasn't just a preacher. He was also a gospel music artist. He recorded numerous albums, and his piano playing became almost as famous as his preaching. The man had genuine musical talent, and that helped set him apart from other televangelists of his era. But here's where the story gets really wild. In 1988, Jimmy Swaggart's world came crashing down in one of the most public religious scandals of the decade. It all started with a rivalry between televangelists. Swaggart had been involved in exposing fellow televangelists Jim Bakker and Marvin Gorman for sexual misconduct. But then the tables turned on him. Marvin Gorman, seeking revenge, hired a private investigator to follow Swaggart. And what they found was explosive: photographs of Swaggart with a prostitute at a seedy motel. The scandal broke wide open, and Swaggart was forced to make one of the most famous televised confessions in religious history. Standing at the pulpit of his own church, with tears streaming down his face, Swaggart delivered the line that would define his legacy. "I have sinned against you, my Lord." That confession became a cultural moment. It was parodied on Saturday Night Live, referenced in movies, and became shorthand for public religious hypocrisy. The image of Swaggart crying and confessing became one of the most recognizable moments in television history. But here's the thing: the confession wasn't enough to save his career. The Assemblies of God, his denomination, defrocked him. His television audience plummeted. Donations dried up. The empire he'd built over decades crumbled almost overnight. And then, just 3 years later, he was caught again, this time with another prostitute. Any chance of a quick comeback was destroyed. The fall from grace was spectacular. Swaggart went from being one of the most powerful religious figures in America to being essentially a pariah in mainstream Christianity. His television ministry continued, but on a much smaller scale. Instead of hundreds of stations, he was down to just a handful. Instead of millions of viewers, he was reaching a fraction of his former audience. The financial impact was devastating too. At his peak, his ministry was bringing in over $150 million a year. After the scandals, that number dropped to a tiny fraction of what it once was. But beyond the professional consequences, there was a personal cost too. Swaggart's family had to live with the shame and public humiliation. His wife Frances stood by him through it all, but you can imagine the strain it put on their marriage and family. His son Donnie, who had been groomed to potentially take over the ministry, had to watch his father's legacy crumble. The Swaggart name, which had once been synonymous with successful televangelism, became associated with scandal and hypocrisy. Despite everything, Swaggart never completely disappeared. He continued preaching, continued his television ministry on a smaller scale, and continued recording gospel music. In later years, he seemed to find some measure of peace and redemption. He never fully regained his former prominence, but he maintained a loyal following of people who believed in his message of redemption and forgiveness. His ministry, Jimmy Swaggart Ministries, continued operating the Family Worship Center in Baton Rouge and broadcasting on the Sun Life Broadcasting Network. It was a shadow of what it once was, but it was something. So what's Jimmy Swaggart's legacy? That's complicated. On one hand, he was undeniably talented, both as a preacher and as a musician. At his peak, he was reaching millions of people with his message. On the other hand, his scandals damaged not just his own reputation, but the reputation of televangelism as a whole. He became a symbol of religious hypocrisy and the dangers of mixing faith with fame and fortune. His story became a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of power and money, even in religious contexts. It showed how quickly an empire built on faith could crumble when that faith was betrayed. Following his death, Swaggart's family has been relatively quiet about the specifics of his final days. They've focused on his role as a husband, father, and grandfather rather than dwelling on the controversies that defined much of his public life. His wife Frances, who stood by him through all the scandals, is now 89 years old. His son Donnie has been involved in the ministry for years and will likely continue the family's religious work, though on a much smaller scale than his father's heyday. The family has invited the public to attend the funeral services, both in person and through live broadcast. It's a sign that they're not hiding from his legacy, but rather trying to focus on the positive aspects of his life and work. Whether you liked him or not, Jimmy Swaggart was a significant figure in American culture. He represented the rise of televangelism in the 1980s, the power of religious media, and the potential for both inspiration and corruption that comes with that power. His confession became a template for public apologies. His rise and fall became a story about the American dream, and the American nightmare rolled into one. Even today, his name is referenced when talking about religious scandals or the dangers of unchecked power in religious organizations. He became a cautionary tale that's still relevant decades later. Swaggart's death also marks the end of an era in televangelism. He was part of a generation of preachers who used television to build massive ministries and reach millions of people. Many of his contemporaries, Jim Bakker, Oral Roberts, Pat Robertson, have also passed away or stepped back from the spotlight. The style of televangelism that Swaggart represented, emotional, musical, and highly personal, has largely been replaced by more polished, corporate-style religious programming. So there you have it, the death of Jimmy Swaggart at age 90. A man who rose to incredible heights, fell to spectacular lows, and spent the final decades of his life trying to find redemption. His story is uniquely American, a tale of ambition, success, failure, and the possibility of second chances. Whether you see him as a fallen prophet or a cautionary tale depends largely on your perspective, but there's no denying that he was a significant figure in American religious and cultural history. The funeral services are scheduled for this Sunday at the Family Worship Center in Baton Rouge. It'll be interesting to see how many people show up to pay their respects to a man who was both beloved and reviled, sometimes by the same people at different times. That's it for today's report. Let me know in the comments what you think about Jimmy Swaggart's legacy. Was he a genuine man of faith who made mistakes, or was he something else entirely? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.